different is always better than better.
You have to be so remarkably better than the option that people are gonna like go through the pain of changing.
Why don't most companies talk in depth about stock options to their employees?
Google Sheets is the #1 killer of startup ideas.
We're just trying to build the company that we wanted to work at. Welcome back to the Rise Over Run podcast. I'm Doug Barnett. I'm here with Brant Choate.
What's up?
The audience that we want to talk to are people that either work for startups or want to work for a startup. You know, there's a lot of content out there of people saying, what makes a good startup idea? How do you know, as a founder, if you had a good startup idea? We're going to twist this just a little bit, which is, if you work at a startup or you're evaluating working at a startup, how can you know whether the startup that you're applying for, working at, etc., is onto something? There are 5 frameworks that we're going to evaluate a startup through this lens. The founders, meaning, are the founders that work at your startup uniquely qualified on the idea that they're working on, for whatever reason? The market, and specifically, if you're working at a startup and it's venture-backed, you have to believe that the market is of a sufficient size for the company to get large without having to take a huge portion of the market in order to win. The product, Tyler Hogue likes to say, and I think he stole this from someone else, but he likes to say, different is better than better. Is your product a step function change somehow that you're working through? And do you have some type of acquisition hack in your go-to-market strategy? And then finally, they call this monopoly, but it essentially is, how, as you scale, does the flywheel turn in your favor? Does it get easier and easier for your company to succeed? And I think, Brant, you brought this to light. Where did you get this 5 framework from?
This is from Kevin Hale. He founded a company called Woofu, and it was kind of successful in the early 2000s, early 2010s. And then he was a partner at YC for a little while. I always liked him, and I think he kind of had some of the most like concise ways of thinking about all this stuff. So it's sort of like an old, more, I don't know, niche YC talk, but just kind of feels a little easier to reason through than some of the other ways of thinking about this.
Okay, so let's talk founders first.
Yeah.
What are the things that you should look for as an employee of saying, okay, are the founders that I'm working for uniquely qualified to work on this idea?
Yeah, so I think if you're looking at founders and you're trying to evaluate, do they actually have a unique advantage towards starting a company? I don't believe that very many founders actually do. I think, in the context of this, these are people that maybe like had a unique invention. They're like actual rocket scientists. Maybe they invented the search algorithm at Google, like those types of things. People that maybe there's like 1,000 people in the world that maybe fit into this category. If you were the best in your class at Stanford or wherever, or you were a product manager at Google or Podium even or whatever, it's helpful, but it's not the type of like really unique advantage that I think, is gonna set you apart as a company. And I think investors would kind of see this in the same way, and probably you should as like a startup employee.
Yeah, so if we take, our startup Remi, our partner Reno, is in our space, he fits this criteria. And one of the ways that you can look at, well, how do I know if like one of the founders or the founders are uniquely qualified? Usually there is something that has happened in the company that you're like, what? And that moment for us, like we were on a call with one of our YC partners, Brad Flora, and at the time we had 7 employees total, including the founders, and we won a contract with the largest solar provider in the country, in Sunrun. And we did that because of Reno. That's how we got it done. Reno was like uniquely qualified to go win that deal. And Brad basically is like, you guys must have some type of like deal-making superpower And that's right. That's exactly what it was. It was something that Reno was uniquely qualified for. And so look for those signals. It's not so much like go look at their LinkedIn and their resume. Go look at what's happened in the company. And it could be, some type of piece of technology that's like, whoa, this is totally different than anyone else. If you look at like Linear as an example, Carrie, like you can look at the product and be like, this literally feels like a different thing. Anyway, don't just look at resumes. Look for signals inside of the company itself.
There is nuance here that I think applies to us as well. It's not that our backgrounds are helpful in running the company. I'm just kind of commenting on, the type of thing that really stands out independent of anything else. If you were to just even take the way we all work together,
Yep.
I think it's been common for people to join Remi and, especially at an executive level, and to hear things like, this is the first functional executive team I've ever been a part of. You guys all seem to like each other.
It's okay that someone said, I don't know in the executive meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's some of those things that I think are actually pretty unique as well. But, if you're like from the outside looking in, this like founder signal is pretty rare, I would say.
Okay, so then we go to market. How do I know whether the market, like what type of research can I do about the market itself that leads me to have any inclination or knowledge that this is like, okay, if we go win 5% of the market, we're a huge company?
Probably the easiest is during interviewing, if you're just asking the people you're interviewing with. A great signal is if you're interviewing with not the founders and the hiring managers can answer this question.
Yeah.
I think that, it probably is like a good signal that the company is communicating well, and then also that there actually is something there. More concretely, what you'd be looking for though is, do they have a belief it's a big market, and then have they really kind of like done the deep thinking as to why? And the latter part's really important because, I've even kind of done this mistake myself founding companies. One of my former companies was basically consolidating customer feedback and making sense of it and finding the themes. And if you're, a sufficiently large company, you have thousands and thousands of support requests, and you have thousands of customer feedback coming through 10 different channels. And I want to press button and have it tell me my top 10 things to go work on the product side. Feels like it would apply to a pretty massive market. And I think in theory it applies to every company. But what I found is that the amount of dollars across every company that people were willing to spend was extraordinarily low.
The budget allocation in
Yes.
this category was not very large.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. So even in a company, where I was working with Slack, Uber, Airbnb, like some of the largest companies you think would make use of this thing, and we were kind of capping out around 500 to 1,000 a month on, paying for help in something like this. And then someone that was really smart pointed me to comps in the space. And they're like, well, who's the best at this right now, even though it's a worse product? We went looking around and then more or less found out that the highest value that any company had ever gotten to in this space was like 800 million. And like that was my ceiling. And that was kind of, when I knew in this context, that company was not venture scale.
Yep.
So I think that's kind of like some nuance to really poke at if you're looking at a market.
Distilling it all the way down, it isn't just how many people or how many companies would want this, but also what are the total dollars that are actually going to get spent in this market?
Some proof of willingness to pay it.
That's right.
That's more than one company.
Okay, so on to the product now, and once again, stealing this line that it's better to be different than better. How should I think about looking at someone's product as this is differentiated enough, this is new enough in order to make a really solid evaluation that this product has a chance to be a step function improvement to the incumbents?
One of the hardest lessons to learn when you're building products is that what you think is actually, 10 times better, step function better is pretty rarely the case. So I think the best way of proving this point in my experience is if you go look at the amount of startups that have failed, and the reason that they failed is because they couldn't overcome Google Sheets.
That's a great one.
If you actually want to stand out, you have to be so remarkably better than the option that people are going to like go through the pain of changing. And especially if it's valuable, it's likely that the pain of changing or swapping the solution to solve the pain is pretty high. This one's hard too because I think it depends on how established a given pain to solution matchup is. So if I'm like taking a concrete example, like we talked about linear steps into a space that's essentially keep track of my work, project management, issue management. A little more specifically is kind of like an engineering way of saying project management. But I don't know, there's like 30 years of work done there already, and a very, very, very established player in Jira. And they had to build and bring kind of a way of doing things that took a very long time for them to establish like MVP and work on kind of like building a fresh approach to this thing that no one had ever seen before. As we're thinking about trying to serve homeowners and some of these big enterprises and then working with roofing contractors, one of the nice things about our space is that it's gotten quite a lot less attention than something like linear. So as we're thinking about building out solutions, the fact that we're coming at it with sort of this like Silicon Valley approach is somewhat novel and is just sort of 10x better by the nature of us, taking the approach we are.
It's cliche to use Uber as an example, but if Uber had started with, do you know what we want to do with taxis? We want to make them just better in every way. Like the experience is so amazing in the back seat. The drivers are so kind. The air conditioning is perfect. There's chilled water waiting for you in the back. There's chargers for your phone. It's completely silent. They've noise-proofed the back seat. Well, none of that was it. It was just call it from your phone and they'll just come to you.
Yeah.
It's so different than the initial.
Yep.
And that's the framework of like, is this company trying to build a perfect back seat in a taxi, or are they trying to like let you hail the thing from the corner?
Yeah.
And that is different, is way easier to stand out than just better on the incumbent, which is why what Linear is doing is really hard.
Yeah.
Because Jira is there and it's essentially the same thing, and Linear is better, but it's not markedly different than what Jira is doing. Slight differences. Better startups can win eventually, much, much, much harder than just reinventing kind of a new way to do something in a space. We've done founder, we've done product, we've done market. Now we got to talk about acquisition.
Yep.
Here's the default. Let's go spin up some ads and put them on Google or Meta. Let's test and see how this works.
Or spin up a landing page that has early access or a wait list and spam it out.
It's interesting because a lot of founders that we talk to are selling software. Selling software is very, very hard right now. Budgets have shrunk. AI is coming for many single point solutions. I think as an employee, you've got to look and say, okay, how is this company going to win in an acquisition strategy in the long term? Is there something significantly different about what they are doing? And this is just as hard as any of the others to find differentiation.
Yeah.
That's like the first thing that you should look at. What other signals are you looking for on this acquisition point?
In terms of like unique advantage, I think, you're looking for people that maybe have a lot of pre-existing connections as like one acquisition unique advantage. That's certainly the case with us. That is a massive advantage that you already commented on with Reno. People do figure out things here from time to time, whether it's like Google just changed their algorithm and now I sort of have this moment in time where I can do this SEO play that boosts me up. Maybe they have kind of some previous experience running ads at scale and have some alpha there or whatever. I think honestly one that probably applies to most Utah companies is access to the talent pool here. I think it regularly blows people's minds when I spend time in the Bay Area as to like what gets done here.
From a sales perspective.
Yeah, from a sales perspective. If you're a startup employee, some questions I might ask is to like some of the basics around like acquisition costs. Like a really weird thing that happens in an early stage startup is that it's like, I don't know if this is like a ZERP thing or not, but like over the last 10 years, let's just say, it's very common to run at a 1-to-4 ratio, meaning for every customer I got, I had to spend, for every dollar I got, I had to spend 4.
It's not great.
And in the early days, like let's just say up to like Series A, some in the middle, B even sometimes, totally fine. And the hope is that that goes kind of like closer to 1-to-1. The problem with that is you can get up to being like 500, 1,000 people and you're running at this, pretty unsavory ratio of how much it takes for you to make a dollar. And unwinding that and pulling out and becoming even is pretty hard. So the worst version of what I'm talking about is when you're talking to a company and they haven't even done this type of calculus at all, which is more common than you would think.
And this is another thing that maybe as an employee you could look at and say, all right, from a product perspective, are we different instead of better? That also can be true on acquisition strategy. A lot of the companies that are early stage, Series A, Series B in that range, that are succeeding in this market are free. There's no cost to the software. That helps in acquisition when you don't have to charge the consumers and or the companies. As an example, I was looking at my bill for my 10-year-old's Gab phone, which is another company here in Utah, $65 a month. My entire bill for the other 4 people in my family for T-Mobile from Previ, which is another company here locally, $104. Who's gonna win?
Yeah.
This is the type of stuff that you've got to be really honest with yourself when you're evaluating is like, what is our chance to win in these markets? And because it's very competitive and very, very difficult. And so innovation on go-to-market is probably right now just as important on innovation on product. And you've got to be evaluating these things kind of in tandem together in parallel. Last thing here, which is monopoly. I think maybe a different version, a way to say this is like, does this business have a flywheel? That as we get bigger, it gets easier and it spins. So what's an example of this that someone could look for?
We keep referencing Uber, but I think it's a classic one. The larger they got, the easier it is for a rider to get a ride, to get it quickly. I think the costs, overall get more easy to stomach no matter where you are. When in reality, if you order an Uber in the middle of like a farmland, they're losing money, but they subsidize it with what happens in the cities.
Yep.
So that's like really hard if you and I are deciding to go compete against Uber today. It's probably actually impossible. Like
or Amazon, like
Yeah.
a scaled company that has a really great flywheel.
You might have to slog in $100 billion to have some chance at going to compete with Uber and get started and just have a chance. So
Because they've already gotten more drivers equals more riders equals shorter wait times, which makes their drivers more money, which makes them have more drivers, which has more it just spins
Yep.
over and over and over again. Let me tell you the opposite of this. Our go-to-market is Google Ads. And the one thing that Google Ads, that scales. Huge markets. Here's what doesn't scale on Meta and Google. Cost. It never gets cheaper. In fact, it only gets more expensive to acquire. Even if you're scaling in quantity, you're never getting economies of scale.
Yep.
And the reason is there is no company on earth, literally ever in the history of earth, that has been better at perfectly defining the maximum amount of money that they can extract from you and still keep you as a customer than ads on Meta and Google. The most efficient businesses of all time. So you're never getting any advantage. You're just not. So that's like, if that's the only way you guys are going to grow, and that's the core function of the business from a go-to-market, you got to be really honest with yourself about how much can this business really scale, because the economics are never going to improve. So those are the like contrasting styles, things that you should look for. Any last thoughts here on like signals that startup employees should look for about why their startup could or would succeed and is uniquely positioned to win?
It's very rare for any startup to have all of these. I think you're kind of looking for like 2 or maybe 3. And a lot of like very famous companies, if you go break them down, kind of had somewhere like that, 2 or 3. I think especially if you're talking about young, like let's just say you're gonna go work for 2 22-year-old founders. The likelihood of them having figured out any of these up front is probably approaching 0. And so, you know, there's a trade-off there in that you probably can join a company like that and have a lot more opportunity. You might be able to be one of the actual people that develops one of these sort of benefits over time, which is, you know, very helpful for your career. And you might be able to get more equity. But I think you know, if I'm putting myself into the seat of someone like YC, for example, where they do fund a lot of they fund like 17-year-olds, I think. They're kind of looking for people that they think are very likely to figure one of these things out. And so there is some underpinning of all of this of just like, is this person baseline high intellect and not likely to give up? And maybe it's like kind of tying into that Jensen Huang quote that went around, you know, a couple months ago, where you just have to be willing to like chew on glass. And his way of putting it was having low expectations.
Yeah.
But you know, you're not likely to give up after getting punched day after day after day. And those seem to be people that YC funds and believe will figure one of these out. So some trade-offs to maybe consider that make this a little more nuanced.
Okay. Good discussion on how to evaluate a startup. We're going to come back and do a few mailbag questions. Every founder is going to nod their head because this is the question every single person at some point along their journey in interview or starting, every employee asks, what is my equity worth? Some variation of what is my equity worth? What percentage of the company do I own? What's the share price of the stock worth, the fair market value? In our all hands meeting this week, we actually had about 47 disclosures before we started the discussion. And then we walked people through how stock options work, the taxation treatment, the different variations of exercising your options, etc. And I think the first question that I would have for you, Brant, is why don't most companies talk in depth about stock options to their employees?
I think some amount of it's out of fear, some amount of it's out of selfishness. There's all kinds of, I don't know, like disadvantages when you're negotiating with people that don't understand on the other side, like information asymmetry. So, you know, there's some benefit there. I think a good amount of it is ignorance, and it's complicated, and the founders themselves don't even understand it, and they're just being told things through lawyers and financial advisors, and you know, standing up in front of the company and saying, hey, ask questions about this stuff is kind of a little bit scary in that sense. Those are probably like the main 2 reasons.
Okay, so here's some questions that you as an employee can ask. What are my exercise rights on my stock options?
Yep.
That's a good one. Why does that matter?
The shortest way to put it is it's going to influence how much money you make and how much tax you have to pay and how much you have to pay directly for the options themselves. So it's really just going to influence whether you gain from these things or not. And there's all kinds of different ways that these are administered. It's not just kind of a one-size-fits-all thing at all.
Yep. So here's a red flag that someone can look for. If in the recruiting process of the startup that you're working for or trying to work for, they touted equity as a reason to join the company, and then there is not detail ever given to you about how that equity works, there's some really interesting, important things that you can ask about. You should probably go talk to your CPA or learn about what QSBS is. Stands for Qualified Small Business Stock. If the company has less than $50 million of assets, which is every seed stage company, and most Series A companies, and even some Series B companies, depending on what their valuation comes back at, and every one of these companies has to comply with a code in the IRS code called the 409A, which is an independent third-party evaluator has to come say, this is using X or Y reasonable technique. This is what we believe the company is worth. And if that comes in below $50 million, you are qualified for QSBS. And that means on your first 10 million of stock, there is no taxation. So that's the first. The second would be, do I have early exercise rights? Meaning, when you get there's a strike price of your stock, and when you get your stock given or issued to you, your options issued to you, can you exercise those options immediately or within X first part of your employment, X period of time?
Strike price being the pre-negotiated price that you would pay for them.
Correct.
Yeah.
And is it the same as the fair market value, which is the 409A price? And if you have early exercise rights, depending on how much the company is worth and the stock price, et cetera, it probably makes sense for you from a taxation perspective to take a little bit of risk and buy and exercise your options early on in your tenure at the company, which has huge tax advantages later on. And usually if you leave the company has the option to repurchase those shares anyway. So it's a fairly low risk proposition as long as the company is doing well.
Yeah.
But I don't think nearly any startup employee understands this stuff and definitely does not ask. And I know this from experience. None of our employees are asking this stuff in interviews.
Yep.
So I think you need to be very thoughtful about this, both as a founder, educate your employees. Educated employees are happy employees. And then also, as an employee, you've got to really understand if equity is one of the reasons I'm at this company, do I know why this equity could be worth something? So at Remi, we've chosen, as it relates to all this stock and other things, we are a very transparent company with our employees. There's a really key reason for this, and it's the same reason why we have the benefits that we have, why we pay the way that we pay, is it's what I want as an employee.
Yep.
We're just trying to build the company that we wanted to work at. And I want as much transparency as the company can provide legally and safely to the employee base, and that changes depending on what stage the company is at. I want as transparent information as possible as an employee. And that's the main reason that I want to provide transparency. Is there any other reasons that you think it matters to employees?
Same fundamental reason. I just think, we've all had experiences working at other companies where you really, in a way, trust and rely on them to communicate to you in a way that you can build your life around. And we don't take lightly that people, move here to work for us, that they give up other opportunities, and ultimately, for most of the people here, they, use the money that we pay them to provide for their families. And so the thought of hiding things that can be fairly impactful to their well-being and taking care of their family is something that, I wouldn't want and I don't want to put down onto our employees.
If your early stage company is not being transparent, it's not an accident. They're trying to hide something for some reason, and there's some interest in it for the company to hide that information. It's rarely good for you.
Yeah, and I think most companies that hide stuff, it is, in my view, more out of ignorance and laziness than sort of, a bunch of people in the back room like sitting and
Mr.
plotting.
Burns.
Because it is a lot of work to explain this stuff. You bring up a topic and people are like, oh, I didn't know that existed. I have 10 other questions now.
Yep.
Like, okay, well, now I need to spend 3 hours answering them. And that's just sort of the trade-off you make.
That is an interesting point, that any all-hands meeting where you're introducing new information has a long tail of one-on-ones.
Yes.
Where those topics are going to be discussed at length.
Yep.
Most startup employees don't know that if the company is structured correctly and it's an early stage, early exercise rights should be given to employees to exercise their stock options early in their tenure, not just at a transaction or when they leave. All right, some interesting topics on today's pod. Hopefully helpful for people to begin evaluating their startup, asking some questions about their equity, and we will catch you guys on the flip.
See ya.